There's a kind of silence you only find at the edge of things. Not the absence of sound, exactly. More like a stillness that settles in after enough time has passed without anyone asking questions. That's the kind of quiet Elias Cobb lived in. For 12 years, he called the dry outskirts of Red Bluff home. If you drove too fast, you'd miss his place completely. Just a crooked fence, a half-collapsed barn, and a stretch of hard land too stubborn to grow much of anything. His cabin leaned a little to the left, patched over the years with mismatched planks like an old coat someone kept mending long after it should have been replaced. There were chickens in the yard, a mule too old to haul more than a water bucket, and inside a wood stove that hissed in the winter and refused to catch fire when the wind blew too hard. But it was enough. It was home. Elias didn't keep visitors. He didn't send letters. Most folks in town remembered him vaguely, that soldier fella. But they'd long forgotten what side he'd fought on, or if they ever knew to begin with. He never offered it, and no one asked. Wasn't proud, wasn't ashamed, just done. After the war, he drifted, fixed railways, hauled freight, then nothing. Eventually, he landed on that patch of Red Bluff and stayed there, like a stone that finally stopped rolling. His days had a rhythm. Up before sunrise, black coffee on the stove, feed the chickens, mend whatever the wind tore down the night before. The kind of life where your boots wear out before your temper does. He never married, didn't have kids, never got around to telling anyone why. Maybe he figured the world had taken enough from him that he didn't owe it anything else. I wonder if you've ever known someone like that. Someone who's been carved down to the bone by time and silence. Maybe it's your grandpa, or maybe it's the neighbor who waves but never speaks. There's something about those people, like they're holding back a story that's just too heavy to tell. I think Elias had one of those stories. He wasn't a cruel man, just quiet. The kind of quiet that builds up around you like dust on a windowsill. Not on purpose, just by being still long enough. He didn't smile much, but not because he was angry. It's just that smiling takes effort. And out where he lived, effort was saved for things like fixing roof leaks and keeping the fire going through the frost. Some people are made for noise and company. Elias wasn't. He was made for the hush between wind gusts, for the creak of old wood under boot steps. He was made for watching the horizon without needing it to bring anything. But life has a strange way of cracking open the doors we've nailed shut. Because on one ordinary afternoon, with the sun dipping low and his hands full of kindling, Elias looked up and saw a child standing at the edge of his fence line. Dirty, barefoot, skin stretched thin over bones, a girl no older than 7, maybe younger. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared, arms wrapped around herself like she was the last person left in the world. And in that moment, something shifted, just slightly. Not because Elias wanted it to, but because sometimes when the world sets someone on your path, you don't turn them away. Not even if you've always known how to live alone. You ever felt that? That flicker in your chest when someone you didn't expect shows up and doesn't ask for much, just not to be left behind? Elias didn't say much that day. Didn't offer comfort or ask questions, but he left the door open behind him when he walked inside. And that, for a man like him, was louder than any welcome. And maybe that's where this story really begins, with a man who thought he had nothing left to give, and a girl who needed just enough to survive the night.
Elias Cobb wasn't the kind of man people visited. If you'd asked anyone in Red Bluff about him, they'd probably shrug and say something like, "He's still out there, I guess, keeps to himself," and that would be the end of it. No stories, no gossip. Just an old soldier with a mule, a few chickens, and a cabin that looked like it was holding itself together out of habit. He liked it that way, or maybe he'd just gotten used to it. The world had taken its share of him, in the war, in the years after, in the long days spent fixing fences and tending to things that didn't talk back. He didn't mind silence. In fact, he trusted it. There was a kind of honesty in being alone, where no one asked you to explain yourself or offer more than you had left. And then, one afternoon, the silence changed. He was splitting kindling near the porch, the same way he always did, slow, steady, like everything else in his life. The wind was soft, not carrying much sound, and then it stopped. The kind of stillness that makes your body notice before your mind does. He looked up. There she was, a little girl, standing just outside his fence line, barefoot, dirt smeared across her legs and arms, dress torn in places that shouldn't be, hair like straw, tangled and stiff. She couldn't have been more than 7, but the way she stood, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes locked on him without blinking, it was like the world had taught her things no child should ever know. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. Now, Elias, he didn't like kids, not because he hated them, just didn't know what to do with them. Never had any of his own, and life had made him hard in ways that didn't leave much room for softness. But something about this little girl, her stillness, the way she looked right through him, it unsettled him. He didn't move toward her, didn't ask her name, just turned, slow, walked into the cabin, and came back out with a piece of cornbread wrapped in an old cloth, set it on the porch railing, sat down and waited. It took her a while to move, cautious like a stray animal testing the air. She didn't grab the food, she studied it first, like it might disappear or bite back. Then she reached up with both hands and ate, slow, careful, like her body barely remembered how. He didn't say a word, just watched. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. After she ate, he went back in again and returned with a blanket, held it out, said nothing. She took it. No thank you, no nod, just accepted it, like she was used to not being asked. He pointed to the corner of the porch, a spot tucked behind the rain barrel where the wind couldn't get to her. She curled up there, blanket pulled to her chin, eyes still open. He didn't ask where she came from, figured if she wanted to be gone by morning, she would be. And she was. When the sun came up, Elias opened the door to find the spot empty. No footprints, no sound, just the blanket, folded, neat, resting where he last seen her. He stood there a long while, not because he was confused, but because something in his gut twisted and he didn't know what to do with it. Maybe you felt that when someone brushes against your life for just a moment and somehow it stays with you longer than it should. A kind of echo that keeps you looking out the window more than usual, wondering. Elias kept that blanket by the door after that. Didn't know why. Maybe a part of him hoped she'd come back, or maybe he just couldn't let go of the fact that for the first time in years, someone had needed him. And that night, when he sat by the fire, boots on, gun nearby, sleep just out of reach, it wasn't fear keeping him awake. It was something quieter, something older, like the question that lives inside all of us. What happens when the world asks us to care again, even after we've forgotten how?
3 days passed. The kind of quiet days where the wind feels heavier than usual and every creak in the floorboards seems to mean something. Elias had gone back to his routines, feeding the mule, patching the fence, tossing feed to the chickens. But his mind, it wasn't sitting still the way it used to. He kept glancing toward the fence line, listening for footsteps that didn't come. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was something else. A sort of waiting you don't admit to yourself. And then, one evening, as the light began to slip out of the sky and the day turned to that kind of gold only late autumn gives, they came back. He was by the chicken coop when the mule gave a snort, just sharp enough to break the hush. He looked up, and there they were, 2 figures this time. The little girl, same dress, same defiant eyes, but now, beside her, a woman. Thin, hollow-cheeked, hair pulled back rough. There was strength in her, though, the kind that comes from surviving things no one should have to. She didn't look scared, just tired, and braced, like someone who's been told no more times than they can count. She had one hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder, not holding her, more like grounding her. And then she spoke, voice steady, plain. "We ain't looking for charity, just somewhere we can stop running." That was it. She didn't explain where they'd come from, didn't plead, just said what needed saying and waited. And Elias, well, he didn't say a word either. He just looked at her for a long time, then turned toward the cabin, walked to the door, and pushed it open. Left it wide behind him. You ever have a moment like that, where you don't say yes, you don't say no, you just let someone in? I think it takes more strength than we realize. Not the kind you show, but the kind you carry in silence. The kind that changes the shape of a place. Inside the cabin, the woman stepped carefully, took it all in. The fire still crackled. The smell of beans lingered from earlier. The kind of warmth that doesn't just come from heat, but from something lived in, worn soft by time. The girl, Lahi, that's what her mama called her, hovered close, eyes alert, scanning the space like she might have to bolt again at any second. May, the mother, stayed near the door, said quietly, "We won't stay long, just need to rest a bit." Elias didn't respond. He just set out 3 bowls without asking if they were hungry. He knew. They sat at the table, May stiff, guarded, Lahi perched on the edge of her seat, feet swinging but never settling. The food was simple: beans, hard bread, gritty coffee, but none of them complained. You could feel something shift that night. Not much, not loud, just a thread beginning to tie itself through the space between them. After the meal, May moved to wash the bowls like it was second nature. She didn't ask if she should, she just did, and Elias didn't stop her. That night, he rolled out an extra blanket, spread it near the stove. May pulled Lahi close and settled in, whispering something quiet as the fire dipped low. No questions about where they'd been, no stories about bruises or how long they'd been on the run. But some things don't need to be said. Some things you feel just by being in the same room. Later, long after the girl had fallen asleep and the wind had picked up again outside, May looked over at Elias, her voice low, almost a murmur. "You sure about this?" And Elias, staring into the coals, didn't even blink. "I ain't done anything yet." "You let us in." He didn't answer. Just nodded slightly, like maybe that meant more than he could explain. And maybe it did. Because some kindnesses, the real ones, they don't come with speeches. They come with an open door, a warm stove, and silence that says, "You're safe now, at least for tonight." And in a world that had taken too much from both of them, maybe that was the first step towards something neither of them had dared to believe in for a long time. A place to stay. Not hide, not big, just stay.
Life didn't change overnight. It never really does it? It's more like something quiet slipping into the room. A new smell in the air, a second cup left drying by the basin, a pair of smaller boots set neatly beside yours on the porch. That's how it started for Elias. After May and her daughter Lahi came through his door, nothing dramatic happened. No big conversations, no promises, just small things. A different rhythm settling into the walls of that old cabin. May didn't ask for anything. That struck Elias. She didn't expect comfort, didn't search his face for reassurance. She simply showed up, sleeves rolled, hands steady, and started doing what needed doing. The very next morning she was up early. She stoked the fire without being told,
cracked eggs with practiced hands, stirred a pot like she'd always known that stove. No hesitation, no questions. Elias watched her from across the room, arms crossed, like he was still trying to figure out how this all fit. And honestly, he didn't know yet, but he didn't stop her either. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, the kind that comes from someone who's learned, probably the hard way, not to take up too much space. She cooked, she cleaned, and later, when the light shifted soft in the late afternoon, she sat by the window and began stitching an old shirt of his. Not to repair a tear, but to adjust the shoulders, narrower, cleaner. She didn't ask permission, she just did it, like she saw what needed fixing. And Elias, he let her. I don't know about you, but I've always believed there's something sacred about the unspoken agreements between people. When someone sees a gap and steps into it without fanfare, not to prove anything, but because it's the decent thing to do. That's how May lived. That's how she earned her place in that cabin, not with words, but with presence. Leahy, the girl, she stayed close to her mother at first, always watching, quiet, alert, like the world had trained her not to relax. But she was changing too, slowly. She'd follow Elias around the yard, not talking much, just curious. She'd carry feed in a little pail and copy the way he scattered it for the hens. One day she found a wind-up toy train tucked on a shelf, something left from a life Elias didn't talk about. She wound it up, let it stutter across the table, and laughed, just once, but it was real, high and hesitant, like she didn't quite remember how it was supposed to sound. Elias didn't laugh with her, but something in his chest cracked a little. And maybe that's what healing looks like sometimes. Not some big breakthrough, just one more laugh, one more breakfast shared, one more hand reaching for the firewood without being asked. May kept the inside in order. She boiled lye soap out back in the big pot, scrubbed the floors, aired out the quilts. She even asked if she could sew curtains for the window over the sink. Elias had never used that window much, but when she asked, he just shrugged and said yes. It was strange, this feeling of the house becoming something else. Not just shelter, not just structure, but home. And it wasn't because Elias had planned it. He hadn't. But somehow their presence made the place feel less like a bunker and more like a life. Still, he kept his distance. Not out of coldness, but just habit. He wasn't used to having people around, wasn't sure how to let them stay. But May didn't mind. She didn't try to pry him open. She didn't ask about the photo tucked behind the stove or why he sometimes stared too long at the fire. She gave him space, and maybe that was the kindest thing of all. You know, it's a strange thing when people quietly start filling the empty places in your life. Not by asking you to change, but by simply being there, doing what needs to be done, and letting you watch the world shift around them. That's what Elias was doing now, watching, and slowly, whether he realized it or not, letting them in.
Funny how a place can feel empty long after it's been built. Elias's cabin had stood for over a decade, weathered but steady, roof patched more times than he could count, a stove that still hissed every time the wind shifted just wrong. It had 4 walls, a bed, a chair by the fire, and shelves with things that once meant something. But for a long time, none of it felt lived in, just maintained, like the man who owned it. But something had begun to shift. It wasn't loud, this change. It didn't crash in or announce itself. It came in like the morning fog, soft and unnoticed, until one day you realized you could see your own breath in someone else's presence, and it didn't feel cold. Leahy was the first to break the quiet. She found an old wind-up toy on the shelf, tucked behind some worn books, a metal train with chipped paint and crooked wheels. Elias hadn't touched it in years. It belonged to a memory he no longer dusted off. But she wound it up, watched it clatter across the table, and then she laughed. Not a loud, carefree laugh like most kids, but something softer, a small sound, sharp with surprise like her body remembered what joy felt like, but needed a minute to get used to it again. And Elias? He didn't laugh with her. That wasn't his way. But he watched. And for a man who hadn't made room for that kind of sound in his life for years, just watching was something. There's a kind of healing in that, isn't there? When someone doesn't try to fix you with words or big gestures, they just offer a space where you can laugh again, even if it's only for a second. May noticed, too. She didn't say anything about it, but that evening, after supper, she stepped out into the cold with a basket in her arms and pointed to the north end of the barn. The roof was starting to sag where the wind had peeled the boards loose. Elias was halfway through saying he'd handle it when she looked at him and said, plain as anything, "If you got a hammer, I can patch it." He handed her the hammer. The next few hours passed in quiet work. Elias held the ladder, May balanced with one hand braced on the roof, the other driving nails through dry wood like she'd been doing it her whole life. No questions asked, no stories offered. Just two people doing what needed doing. That kind of companionship, it sneaks up on you. I remember once watching my own father fix a fence with a neighbor after a storm. Neither of them talked much, but there was a rhythm to it. Handing over nails, steadying posts, that said more than any conversation could. Sometimes, shared work is the only language two guarded people know how to speak. Back in the cabin, the air felt different. The walls, which once echoed with their own stillness, now held warmth. A stew simmered on the stove, the fire glowed deeper. A pair of shoes rested by the hearth that didn't belong to Elias, and for the first time in a very long while, he wasn't the only one making sure the place kept breathing. May had started humming while she cooked, quiet, almost like she didn't know she was doing it. And Elias, from his chair, didn't say a thing, just listened. Lahi had stopped hovering near the door. She started touching things, a spoon, a tin cup, a book with the corner chewed off, not carelessly, but like she was beginning to believe the space wouldn't disappear if she let her guard down. She even named the mule, said he looked like an Oscar. Elias didn't argue. Oscar it was. By the end of that week, something unexpected had taken root. Not comfort exactly, but presence, the kind that takes time to grow. You don't always see it happening, but one morning you wake up, pour your coffee, and realize the house doesn't feel like it's only yours anymore. And that doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a return, like something that wandered off years ago. Trust, maybe, finally found its way home again. So yeah, the cabin was still small, the wind still slipped through the cracks, but now there was laughter in it. A woman's hum in the morning, a child's muddy footprints by the door. And in a place that once held nothing but silence, now it held warmth.
It was just another trip into Red Bluff. A supply run, same as always. Flour, beans, a bit of tobacco, kerosene if it was in stock. Elias didn't go often. Didn't like the noise, the stares, the small talk he never had time or interest for. But the chickens still needed feeding, and the fire didn't light itself. Life had its demands, even if it didn't feel like much of a life some days. He tied up the mule outside the feed store, moved through town with his usual rhythm, slow, steady, head down. Folks nodded, but no one asked questions. He preferred it that way. Until he saw the man, leaned against a post out front of the general store. Clean boots, but rough around the edges. Didn't look like a local. Didn't move like one either. Just stood there, watching. Not the store, not the town, watching him. There was a weight in Elias's gut the moment their eyes met. Not fear exactly. More like recognition, the kind that lives in men who've seen too much and survived anyway. He didn't say a word, just paid for the goods, walked back to his cart,
and left. But something followed him home that day. Not a man, not a horse, just a feeling, coiled tight in his chest like a wire pulled too long. When he stepped through the cabin door, the fire was low, the stew on the stove thickening. May stood by the basin, sleeves rolled, water dripping from her hands. Lahi sat at the table, drawing circles on old scrap paper with a piece of charcoal. He didn't say anything, Elias began, setting down the bag, but he watched close, tall, brown vest, black hat. May didn't freeze, not quite, but her shoulders rose, a small, sharp inhale. Then she spoke. That's one of his brothers. No more detail than that. She didn't need to say the man's name, didn't have to spell out the weight of it. There's a kind of danger that doesn't shout. It just waits, wears a familiar face, leans against posts, and pretends it's got all the time in the world. Elias looked at her for a long moment. You think he followed you all the way out here? I don't know, she said quietly. But if he's sniffing around Red Bluff, it won't take him long. No panic in her voice, just a tired certainty, like someone who's been through this before and knows how it ends. Unless it doesn't. That night, the cabin didn't sleep easy. Elias sat by the door, shotgun across his knees. May checked the windows twice, locked them tighter than usual. The girl, she didn't ask questions, but you could see it in her eyes. Kids know. They always do. There's something about that kind of tension, the kind you don't talk about but can feel in the walls, the way every sound outside feels like a footstep, the way silence grows teeth. The next day, May found Elias in the shed, oiling a hinge that had squeaked for months. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the morning cold. If it comes to it, she said steady, I can shoot. He looked up, not shocked, just surprised by how calm she was. You ever had to? She nodded, once. Didn't hit anything, but it was loud enough to stop him. Elias gave a slow nod and wiped his hands on a rag, then said, plain as anything, there's a 12-gauge in the trunk under the cot. Ain't fancy, but it'll fire. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. You know, there's a moment in every story where the past catches up, whether you're ready or not. And it doesn't always knock loud. Sometimes it just shows up, like smoke slipping through a crack in the door. They didn't know when he'd come, or how, but they knew he would. And that night, with the fire crackling low and the stars hidden behind a ceiling of clouds, Elias checked the rifle one more time. May tucked the girl behind the stove, revolver in her pocket, and together, not with panic, but with resolve, they waited. Because whatever storm was coming, this time, they weren't running.
It was just another trip into Red Bluff. A supply run, same as always. Flour, beans, a bit of tobacco, kerosene if it was in stock. Elias didn't go often. Didn't like the noise, the stares, the small talk he never had time or interest for. But the chickens still needed feeding, and the fire didn't light itself. Life had its demands, even if it didn't feel like much of a life some days. He tied up the mule outside the feed store, moved through town with his usual rhythm, slow, steady, head down. Folks nodded, but no one asked questions. He preferred it that way. Until he saw the man, leaned against a post out front of the general store. Clean boots, but rough around the edges. Didn't look like a local. Didn't move like one either. Just stood there, watching. Not the store, not the town, watching him. There was a weight in Elias's gut the moment their eyes met. Not fear exactly. More like recognition, the kind that lives in men who've seen too much and survived anyway. He didn't say a word, just paid for the goods, walked back to his cart, and left. But something followed him home that day. Not a man, not a horse, just a feeling, coiled tight in his chest like a wire pulled too long. When he stepped through the cabin door, the fire was low, the stew on the stove thickening. May stood by the basin, sleeves rolled, water dripping from her hands. Lahi sat at the table, drawing circles on old scrap paper with a piece of charcoal. He didn't say anything, Elias began,
setting down the bag, but he watched close. Tall, brown vest, black hat. May didn't freeze, not quite, but her shoulders rose. A small, sharp inhale. Then she spoke. That's one of his brothers. No more detail than that. She didn't need to say the man's name, didn't have to spell out the weight of it. There's a kind of danger that doesn't shout. It just waits, wears a familiar face, leans against posts, and pretends it's got all the time in the world. Elias looked at her for a long moment. You think he followed you all the way out here? I don't know, she said quietly. But if he's sniffing around Red Bluff, it won't take him long. No panic in her voice, just a tired certainty, like someone who's been through this before and knows how it ends. Unless it doesn't. That night, the cabin didn't sleep easy. Elias sat by the door, shotgun across his knees. May checked the windows twice, locked them tighter than usual. The girl, she didn't ask questions, but you could see it in her eyes. Kids know. They always do. There's something about that kind of tension, the kind you don't talk about but can feel in the walls, the way every sound outside feels like a footstep, the way silence grows teeth. The next day, May found Elias in the shed, oiling a hinge that had squeaked for months. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the morning cold. If it comes to it, she said steady, I can shoot. He looked up, not shocked, just surprised by how calm she was. You ever had to? She nodded, once. Didn't hit anything, but it was loud enough to stop him. Elias gave a slow nod and wiped his hands on a rag, then said, plain as anything, there's a 12 gauge in the trunk under the cot. Ain't fancy, but it'll fire. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. You know, there's a moment in every story where the past catches up, whether you're ready or not. And it doesn't always knock loud. Sometimes it just shows up, like smoke slipping through a crack in the door. They didn't know when he'd come, or how, but they knew he would. And that night, with the fire crackling low and the stars hidden behind a ceiling of clouds, Elias checked the rifle one more time. May tucked the girl behind the stove, revolver in her pocket, and together, not with panic, but with resolve, they waited. Because whatever storm was coming, this time, they weren't running.
It was early morning when Elias heard the sound. Not the kind of sound you brush off. Not wind through the barn slats or the mule shifting in its stall. This was heavier, measured, a boot against frost-cracked earth. One step, then another. He rose from the chair near the door, shotgun already resting across his lap. He'd been sitting there since just after midnight, fire low, coat still on, waiting. Not out of fear. No, that wasn't it. It was something closer to readiness, a sense that whatever had been circling was finally making its way to the porch. He moved to the window, pulled back the curtain just enough to see, and there he was, a tall man. Coat dark, hat pulled low, a rifle slung over one shoulder like it was just part of him. He wasn't rushing. He was walking slow, steady, the kind of walk meant to be seen, to declare something. And Elias, well, he didn't flinch. He stepped outside before the man reached the steps. The cold hit hard, biting through the fabric, but neither of them spoke at first. They met halfway between the house and the well, standing on flat ground, nothing but cold dirt and frost between them. You Elias Cobb? The man asked, voice too casual. I am. I'm looking for a woman, Melanie, and a girl about this tall. He held a hand down near his waist. You seen anyone like that? Elias didn't answer right away. He studied the man's face, the eyes too sharp, the smile too thin. This wasn't some lost relative or a sheriff on duty. This was someone used to getting what he wanted, someone angry that something had slipped through his fingers. You the one she ran from? Elias asked, low and flat. The man smirked. That her story? Women'll say anything when they're scared. I ain't here to argue, just want what's mine. Elias didn't blink. She ain't yours. It hung in the air, heavier than the cold.
The man took a step closer. You think you're some kind of hero out here? You think hiding her makes you better than me? Elias raised the shotgun. Just enough. Not pointed. Not yet. But clear. I don't think anything. But I buried better men than you. And I won't think twice if you take one more step. You could feel the shift then. The way the man's body tightened. He was sizing it up. Pride, anger, some twisted sense of ownership burning just behind his eyes. Maybe he thought about reaching for his rifle. Maybe he thought about calling Elias's bluff. But then he saw it. The stillness in Elias. The quiet certainty of someone who wasn't trying to prove anything. Just ready. Ready to do what had to be done. And for some reason that was enough. The man backed up a step. Spit in the dirt. She'll run again, he muttered. That's what women like her do. Elias didn't move. Then she'll do it with her head held high. Another pause. Then the man turned, walked back toward the trees where his horse waited. He didn't look back. Elias stood there a moment longer, let the cold soak in, the silence settle again. Then he lowered the gun, turned, and went back inside. May was kneeling by the stove, one arm around Leahy, who was wide awake, eyes big, clutching her mother's dress. He gone? May asked, her voice like dry leaves. Elias nodded. For good? He looked at the fire, then back to her. The kind of gone that counts. May let out a breath she'd been holding for years. The kind of breath you don't even realize is trapped in your chest until it's finally free. And Leahy, she looked up at Elias, her voice was a whisper. You didn't shoot him? No, Elias said, kneeling beside her. Didn't need to. That day the cabin felt different. The door wasn't locked that night. The curtains were left open. May was standing by the sink, hair loose, humming without catching herself. Leahy helped Elias with the hands again, barefoot in the frost and smiling. Sometimes it only takes one stand, one quiet, unwavering moment to tell someone, you're safe now. And sometimes that's all a person's been waiting for.
It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single morning where they all woke up and said, we're safe now. Life doesn't usually work that way. Healing, I've found, is quieter than that. It doesn't come with a grand gesture. It comes in little signs, half noticed, half felt, until suddenly you realize the worst has passed. That's how it was in Elias Cobb's cabin. After the man rode off, after the tension that had clung to the corners of every room finally loosened its grip, something subtle began to shift. It started with the curtains. For weeks they've been drawn tight every evening. May kept them closed before the sun even dipped low, like shadows might carry the past in with them. But one morning, Elias noticed the windows were bare. Sunlight poured in, caught the dust in the air, warmed the wood floor where Leahy liked to sit and draw. No one said a word about it, but that simple choice, to leave the light in, said everything. There was no longer a shotgun resting beside the door. Elias still kept it nearby, sure, but it wasn't cradled in his arms at night. He slept again. Not deep, maybe, but enough to let the fire burn out without fear. May stopped checking the locks twice, stopped flinching at every creak in the porch boards. Her shoulders, always drawn tight before, now rested easier when she moved through the cabin. And Leahy? God, that little girl changed the most. She started running barefoot again, chasing chickens in the yard, calling them by names she made up as she went. She climbed onto the porch rail, held her arms out like wings, and told Elias she was flying. She asked questions now, about the stars, about the mule, about why coffee smelled so bitter but grown-ups drank it anyway. She laughed, loud, without apology. She found an old book tucked behind some pots on a high shelf. May said it used to belong to someone else, but didn't say who. Didn't need to. They read it together every night by the stove. May spoke the words slow and steady, and Leahy would follow along with her finger, eyes big with wonder. She couldn't read yet, not really, but she was learning. You ever notice how sound changes in a place that's been quiet too long? That house used to hum with wind and wood and not much else. Now it held footsteps, laughter, the clatter of a spoon dropped on the floor and someone's voice saying, "It's all right, I'll get it." Elias still didn't talk much, that part of him stayed the same. But he smiled more. Not big, toothy grins, just soft ones, like the kind that come when someone puts a cup of coffee in your hand without asking how you take it. And the house? That place had a pulse now. The blanket smelled like soap. The floor was swept. The air held warmth that didn't come just from the fire. May hung dried herbs near the window. She started sewing new curtains out of scrap fabric, not because they needed replacing, but because she wanted color. Just a little. Something soft and bright. You could feel it in the way she touched things. The basin, the pan, her daughter's hair. Like the world was no longer something to brace against. It was something to belong to again. I think about that sometimes. How a home isn't built with wood and nails. Not really. It's built with trust, with routines that mean something, with silence that isn't tense, but tender. Maybe you've known a place like that. Maybe you've watched someone come back to life, not in a dramatic, sweeping way, but in the way they hum while they stir the soup or leave the door open just a little longer in the evening. That's what happened in that little cabin at the edge of Red Bluff. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't preparing for someone to come knocking. They were just living. And somehow, that was the bravest thing of all.
Some conversations don't happen in daylight. They unfold in the quiet hours, after the dishes have been washed, the fire is low, and the air carries the kind of stillness that makes a person honest. That night, Elias sat in his usual chair, boots still on, arms resting on his knees. The fire threw soft shadows across the floor. You could hear the wood creak under the heat, the wind brushing past the cabin walls like it didn't want to interrupt. Across from him, May sat at the table, stitching the seam of an old shirt. It was Elias's, frayed around the collar, threadbare near the cuffs. She wasn't fixing it for praise, just because it needed doing. That was her way. Lavahi had long since fallen asleep, curled tight on the cot with one hand tucked under her cheek and the other wrapped around the same threadbare doll she'd carried since the day she arrived. For a while, neither adult said anything, just the rhythm of the needle, the soft hiss of the stove. And then, like something that had been waiting its turn to speak, May said almost to herself, "He wasn't the girl's father." Elias looked up, not sharply, just steady, waiting. "He was a man who wore a badge," she said, voice even but low, but not the kind that meant anything. Town looked the other way, folks knew, folks always know. They just didn't want trouble. She paused, fingers still moving with the needle. Then quietly, "I stopped trying to answer him, just learned how to survive it." Elias didn't interrupt, didn't ask her to explain more. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is just let another speak without filling the silence. "I lost my sister when I was 10. Fever took her quick. Then it was just me and Mama for a long while, until it wasn't. After that, it was just me." She glanced at him then. "You ever lose anyone close?" Elias didn't answer right away. He shifted slightly in his chair, staring into the fire like it might burn up the memory before he had to speak it. "My brother, Daniel, died the second year of the war, same field I was in. Couldn't get to him in time." May's hand paused at the edge of the stitch, eyes fixed on the thread. "I still hear him sometimes, not his voice, just the way he ran ahead, always a few paces too far. He never looked back, thought we'd live through it. And then, quieter, I did." The fire cracked gently, almost like it was breathing with them. "I think grief's like a hole in the floor," May said. "You learn to walk around it day after day, But sometimes when you're tired, when it's dark, you forget, and you fall back in. Elias nodded slowly. It never gets smaller, he said. You just get better at not staring into it too long. And in that moment, with the fire warming the corners of the room and the wind leaning against the windows, something passed between them. Not romance, not rescue, just recognition. Two people, scarred in different ways, sitting across from one another in the quiet, not asking to be healed, just seen. You ever felt that with someone? That rare thing where no one has to explain their pain because it already fits the shape of your own? It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it softens something hard in you. May didn't speak again that night. She tied off the thread, folded the shirt, and placed it gently at the end of the table. Elias stood, picked it up, didn't say thank you, just met her eyes with that kind of look that means more than words would have managed anyway. She nodded, and he nodded back. That was it. No promise, no plan, just two people who had been walking alone for too long, finally resting in the same place, under the same roof, knowing that even if the past still followed them in shadows, for now, they weren't carrying it alone.
It started with a question. Not a big one, not something grand or heavy, just a simple, curious question from a little girl sitting at the table, her hair still tangled from sleep, hands wrapped around a warm mug. Do they have a school in town? Elias looked up from his coffee. Lahey was staring at him, eyes wide with something that had been quiet for so long, hope. He nodded slowly. One-room schoolhouse. Miss Clary runs it. She tilted her head. Do they let girls go? He raised an eyebrow. They do. May, who was standing by the stove with her sleeves rolled and a wooden spoon in hand, turned slightly. You want to go? Lahey gave the kind of nod only kids can, quick, certain, like the world just cracked open with possibility. Maybe if you come with me the first day. May didn't answer right away. She looked over at Elias, then back at her daughter. Then she smiled. All right, we'll ask about it next week. And just like that, something shifted. Again. You know, it's funny. The biggest changes in life rarely come with fireworks. Most of the time they sneak up on you in the middle of a normal morning, when the air smells like coffee and wood smoke and there's a question waiting in the quiet that didn't exist the day before. That weekend, they hitched the mule to the small cart. All three of them rode into town together for the first time. Elias hadn't taken company into town in over a decade. His visits were always quiet, quick, with his head down and his words fewer than necessary. But this time, there was a little girl sitting beside him, her satchel bouncing on her lap, holding a folded list May had written out neatly the night before. May sat beside her, hair tied back, chin lifted. She didn't flinch when they passed the feed store, didn't hesitate when eyes lingered too long. People noticed, sure, but no one said anything. That's the thing about small towns. They know when not to ask. When Miss Clary, the school teacher, asked Lahey if she could count to 10, Lahey didn't just nod. She counted twice, loud, steady, just to be sure. That afternoon, they returned with a bag of flour, a tin of tobacco, a new pair of shoes for Lahey, and something Elias hadn't expected to bring home, a sense of belonging that didn't feel borrowed anymore. Later that evening, they sat out on the porch together. The sun dropped behind the ridge, stretching shadows across the yard. Lahey dozed off against her mother's side, clutching the doll she never quite let go of. May leaned back, eyes on the trees. You ever think about the way it all turned out? She asked. Elias thought for a moment, watching the smoke from his pipe rise into the sky. Didn't expect it, he said honestly. May smiled. Me neither. She looked over at him then, not with uncertainty, but with something steadier. You glad you stayed? He turned toward her. I didn't stay, I stopped running. May nodded. Makes a difference. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things unspoken but understood, of days behind them and a future not yet promised but possible. Later that night, Elias carried Lahi inside, her small body limp with sleep. He laid her down on the cot, pulled the quilt over her shoulders. As he turned to step away, she mumbled, half dreaming, "You're not going anywhere, right?" He paused, then squeezed her fingers gently. "I'm right here." When he stood, May was in the doorway. Her eyes were soft, tired, but sure. "She believes in you," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "She should." May stepped closer. "So do I." She didn't need to say anything else. She just laid her head against his chest, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias let someone rest there, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as family. The cabin held steady in the dark, warmed by firelight and something deeper. Outside, the night was still, and inside, they were home. No longer a man alone on the edge of the world, but a man who stayed because something worth staying for had finally come to stay with him.
There's something about the quiet after dinner. The kind that settles, not just in the room, but in the chest, like the world has exhaled and finally let its shoulders drop. The fire in the stove was burning low, casting a soft amber hue on the old wood walls. Outside, the sky had gone that shade between deep blue and dusk, not quite night, not quite day, a place between things, like they all were, in their own way. Elias was washing out the last of the dishes, not because anyone asked him to, but because May had done the cooking, and it felt right. The warm water ran over his hands, and the sound of it filled the silence like a soft stream. May stood by the open window, arms folded on the sill. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, just breathing in the night air. You could hear the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the evening cold. Lae was curled up on the cot with her book, mouthing words she didn't yet fully know how to read. And then May said, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear, "I didn't choose to stay here." Elias didn't answer, just dried his hands, slow and steady, waiting for whatever was coming. "I didn't choose this house, or this town, or you." She turned slightly toward him then, "But I chose to stop running." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the weight those words carried. Not just about geography, about a life, about fear, and what it costs to live with it every day. About deciding, maybe for the first time, to stop flinching at shadows that no longer reach the doorstep. Elias gave the smallest nod. "That's a start." May smiled, not wide but honest, the kind of smile that doesn't need teeth to feel real. Then she looked over at her daughter. Lae had fallen asleep with her head against the side of the cot, one hand still resting on the open book. Elias walked over, knelt beside her, and gently slid the book from under her fingers. She stirred a little, then blinked up at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You're not going anywhere, right?" He didn't answer right away. He brushed a bit of hair from her cheek, then let his hand rest there a moment longer than he usually would. "No," he said softly. "I'm right here." It was only 3 words, but they hung in the air like a promise that had taken a long road to reach them. You ever notice how trust doesn't arrive all at once? It comes in pieces, in looks held just a little longer, in footsteps that don't leave when the storm hits, in quiet assurances spoken not for drama, but because someone small needs to hear them out loud. That night, Elias didn't sit by the door with a shotgun across his lap. He sat on the floor beside the cot, arms resting on his knees, watching the girl sleep, listening to May hum an old tune in the kitchen. The kind of tune you hum when your body finally knows it's safe to make music again. And something inside him shifted. It wasn't some sudden cinematic realization, just a quiet knowing. The kind that settles deep, like the earth after a long drought finally soaking in the rain. He'd spent 12 years alone, not just in the woods, but inside himself, closing off the parts that remembered too much, guarding the pieces that were still soft, even after all that time. But now there was laughter in the morning. Now there was May's jacket hanging on the back of his chair. Now there was a little girl who counted stars before bed and asked if he'd still be there in the morning. And he would be. Because sometimes the greatest thing you can give someone isn't protection or answers, it's presence. I'm right here. It's not flashy, it's not loud, but in a world that so often teaches us to keep running from pain, from memory, from each other, staying becomes the most radical kind of love. And for Elias Cobb, that was enough. That, finally, was home.
It was the kind of evening that makes you believe the world is capable of softness. The sun hung low over the hills, spilling gold over the treetops, setting the field aglow like it had been brushed with light. You could hear the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall grass, the occasional call of a bird heading home, and that quiet, that sacred kind of quiet that only shows up when everything that needed to be said has already been spoken. Elias sat on the porch, legs stretched out, boots dusty from the day. To his right was May, arms resting loosely on her knees, hair catching the last warmth of the sun. On his other side, little Lahi leaned back against the post, a half-eaten apple in her hand, legs swinging just above the step. And for the first time in a long, long while, no one was keeping watch. No shotgun beside the door, no locks checked twice, no whispered plans for what to do if someone came. Just the three of them, together, with the light fading gently around them. You ever have a moment like that? A moment where you realize, without anyone pointing it out, that you're safe, that you've stepped out of the storm without even knowing it? I think it happens quietly, like waking up and realizing you slept through the night for the first time in months, or taking a deep breath and noticing your shoulders didn't rise with it. The body knows before the mind catches up. That's what this was. Elias hadn't planned for any of it. 12 years ago, he'd built his life around distance. One room, one mule, a few chickens, and silence thick enough to keep memories from speaking too loud. He didn't mind the solitude, or maybe he did, but he'd made peace with it. Then a girl had shown up at his fence with eyes full of questions she didn't ask out loud. Then a woman had stepped onto his porch, not asking for saving, just for a place to stop running. And now, here they were, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky paint itself into night. Lahi leaned her head onto Elias's arm without a word. He didn't move, just let her stay there, her weight light but certain. A small act, maybe, but it undid years of walls he didn't even know he'd built. May glanced over and smiled, not one of those polite smiles you give to strangers, but the kind that says, "I see you, and I'm still here." The porch creaked under them as the wind picked up. The last of the sun slipped below the ridge. Fireflies blinked to life across the yard,
tiny flickers like signals in the dark. And for a long time, no one said anything. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they didn't have to. They'd earned this silence. The good kind. The kind built on trust and meals shared without expectation, and long nights when fear sat beside them but didn't win. At some point, May reached over and took Elias's hand, just rested her fingers there, and he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he held on. It's strange how simple gestures, a hand on yours, a child leaning close, a front door left unlocked, can carry the weight of everything that's come before. All the nights of running, all the fear, all the loss. But tonight, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were simply living. Not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, not as people with separate wounds trying not to touch, but as a family. It's not always loud, the forming of something sacred. Sometimes it's just 3 people on a porch at dusk. No promises, no plans, just presence. And that, I think, is enough. That's what home is, after all. Not a place you find on a map, but one you build with time and trust and the courage to stop locking the door. The stars came out slowly, blinking open one by one, like they too wanted to watch a new kind of life begin. And beneath them, the porch light stayed off, because they didn't need it anymore.